It can be really hard to see what's happening when you're cultivating, but if you have a slow motion camera clamped to the cultivator, you can actually see really well what's going on and make the necessary adjustments to make sure that your cultivator is being as effective as possible. About half of the footage I'm going to show you I just recorded with my smartphone, and this is something that a lot of farmers already have, and so it's a great tool to take a closer look at your cultivation and learn things about your cultivator setup that you can't really see with just your bare eye. Last summer I recorded slow motion video from about 15 different cultivators in New York, and I'll go over that footage with you today. It'll start with some between row tools, sweeps and side knives, and then uh, get more into the in-row tools like finger weeders and torsion weeders toward the end. I'm not going to talk about the makes and the models of the tools, but more just show a lot of different types of cultivators and the conditions in which they work well and the adjustments. If you've got a wide cultivator like this, walking behind it and just panning from one side to the other, it's a good way to get a sense of how all the tools are working and whether some are a little bit closer together than others, and see if there's any potential room for improvement. Okay, so this first cultivator that we're going to review is a camera-guided cultivator set up in beets. And it has this hydraulic side shift that you can see it shifting left and right to keep it centered on the row. And if you watch some of the stones really carefully here, you can see that the sweeps, which are up front, will sometimes push the stones in front of the side knives, which will then push the stone into the crop row, which we don't want. So it would be better if the side knives were located in front of the sweeps. Then here's the same tool in just a different part of the field with bigger beets and a little bit drier, fluffier soil. And actually the tools are looking really good and flowing nicely through the soil here. This is just about ideal. And after the cultivator went by, I checked out some of the weeds there, and most of them were undercut, but unfortunately there was still a lot of soil around the roots. And I don't know if this is a regular problem with this cultivator, but if it is, stacking on some additional tines or drags between the rows would help to knock that soil off the roots. Okay, looking at some other side knives, a belly mounted setup. And in this first clip in the lettuce, they're really digging in a little bit too deep, and they're undercutting too much. You can see there's some clods there that are getting undercut where the weeds are still surviving intact in that clod. So if these could get pulled up to be closer to 1/2 inch to 1 inch rather than more like 1.5 inches as they are now, that would be good. And in fact, that's what happened, and they're a little bit closer to the surface here in these leaks. Ooh, it looks like one of the tools is maybe not digging in the forefront of the screen. So that one could be lowered. It's doing a pretty good job with these weeds outside of the crop row, but those right inside, of course, it's not going to touch. Mesmerizing movement of the soil, and this looks just about ideal with a lot of boiling and rippling and action in that top surface, maybe a little bit deep towards the end there. Aha, now you can see why that sweep wasn't digging in as much as it should have been before, and it looks like it's because it was on the side of a ridge there, and also the point of it had been worn down, so it's not going to dig in as much as if it had a nice sharp angled downward point. Okay, now this is more of a standard row crop cultivator with 5 sweeps operating between the row. You can see it working pretty well here, and as it gets set down for this next pass, you can see what the tools look like. Generally there's narrower sweeps near the crop and wider sweeps in the back. And this provides the coverage, but doesn't throw too much soil from those sweeps that are right near the crop row. Unfortunately, in this situation, the weeds are rather large, and you can see that some of those large weeds are so strongly rooted that they're slipping by. Now here's an older cultivator, and this is in some corn. It's working. It's it's disturbing the soil very thoroughly in this narrow band here, where there's about 4 shanks very close together. But unfortunately, it's missing about half the row, and you can see on the left side there's an attachment point with nothing on it. That maybe one of those sweeps could be moved over, or better yet, another sweep or shank onto that setup. And this was a small 2-row cultivator operating behind the tractor, so the farmer was driving very slowly here in these young peas to make sure not to bury them, and doing a pretty good job of throwing just a little bit of soil in towards that in-row zone to potentially bury any of those in-row weeds. This is another 5-sweep row cultivator, and these conditions are just about ideal. You've got a nice big crop of soybeans. It's probably just about the last pass that they can get into these soybeans before the canopy closes. They also have these removable rolling shields that they can use for the first cultivation or so when the crop is too small and would get buried. Okay, transitioning into some of the in-row tools here. This is again a 5-sweep cultivator with some finger weeders following those sweeps. So looking at the sweeps first, most of them looked good and operating at a nice 1/2 inch to 1 inch depth in the soil. But there's this one sweep in the top middle of your screen that wasn't quite deep enough, and so that one could be lowered maybe a 1/2 inch or so. You can see it poking through here and there. The weeds are a little bit large, and that's not due to the farmer's fault at all. It's just that it had been such a wet year this past year that this was just about the first time that they could get in to cultivate. And once again, you see on this 5-sweep cultivator, um, the sweeps nearest the crop row are 2 to 5 inches wide. And then as you get towards the back, sometimes you'll see, that back center sweep, maybe 12 inches wide in some cases, to make sure that you have overlap in coverage and that no weeds are slipping by. This is a drier area within the field, and you can see that most of the soil has been cleaned off of the tools, which is good. It's nice when tools clean themselves. You can see that sometimes those stones interfere with the rolling action of the finger weeders. So that might be something for future research, to try to figure out a sweep placement so that the stones get funneled into the very center, so that they're not encountered by the fingers. And then all of a sudden, you hit a wet spot, and wow, those tools really start digging in, pulling up a lot of loose soil, and they're going to have to slow down here, or maybe just pick up the cultivator and just avoid that patch entirely. You should be able to see some some metal spikes on the underside of these finger weeders that are used to ground drive the rubber parts, but they're really clogged up The fingers are actually still working reasonably well. You can see that they're moving through. They're disturbing that in-row zone. They're doing a little bit of hilling. Unfortunately, the weeds are larger than ideal. In the same soil conditions with maybe half-inch to 1-inch weeds is at most what you'd want to see for the finger weeders. I think they'd probably do a pretty good job even in that wet conditions. And in general, I've cultivated in wet conditions before that you really feel bad for the crop, you feel bad for your soil health, but they do tend to be loose conditions, so that the cultivation is usually pretty effective. And here we have some more wet conditions. Unfortunately, I guess it was the story of the summer. This is a walk-behind tractor. There's some powered wheels pulling these fingers, and this is set up to be a flexible design. It can be used in their crops that are 3 rows per bed, but also works just fine on the crops that are 2 rows per bed, like these beans here. In this case, they had about 2 inches of rain the night before I arrived, and I'm here the next morning, and they said, and they're really just doing me a favor to show me the tools, but things are really too wet. You can see the crop getting moved around in that loose soil. Hopefully they were able to grow out of most of that damage and reroot, but yeah, not ideal conditions. But also you can see that those fingers are touching, and in some cases they're kind of jamming together. And I really don't think there's any reason to put finger weeders that close together. I've seen excellent efficacy in that in-row zone with finger weeders that are up to 5 inches apart. That they're still able to disturb soil and fracture any crust and do a little bit of hilling, even if they're a few inches apart. I don't think that they need to be touching and overlapping like they are here, because it does a lot more crop damage than is necessary. Okay, moving on to look at a tool that did a great job controlling weeds on the edge of plastic mulch, and this is biodegradable plastic mulch. Why you see some holes in it. This is a set of rolling spiders, and I really like this type of design. There's a few different companies making them, and they're set so that even if it picks up some residue, you have these crossbars on the back that will help shed that residue out the back of the tool. And then on this one, they have a finger weeder set vertically closest to the crop, so that even if it does contact the plastic, it's not gonna get hung up on it and pull it out as much as the metal spiders would. And this is actually set up with some hydraulic side shifts, so there's a person on the back of this tool. There's someone driving the tractor, and there's someone on the back actually on the cultivator adjusting it left and right to try to keep it as tight to the plastic as you can. This is another one of those trade-offs where, yeah, to keep the plastic from blowing away in the wind, you want to bury those edges as much as you can, but that also leaves a lot of extra plastic that could get hung up in a cultivator, and that weeds can germinate in the soil on top of that little strip there. So from a weed management perspective, you want to bury as little of the plastic on the edges as possible. And this is a similar rolling type cultivator, but instead of the spiders, it has some discs. You can see it doing a great job getting through the residue, but also that it's set up a little bit too far to the left, and it's doing some leaf pruning. Basket weeders are designed with two sets of baskets. The first one does the is kind of the ground driving aspect of it, and then the second one, connected by a chain, spins a little bit faster. So that the first set of baskets does some undercutting. It spins a little bit slow and does some undercutting, and then the second set spins a little bit faster and kind of turns things over, which conceptually sounds ideal. Set up very close to the crop row here. And because of the design of these basket weeders, you don't have to worry about them throwing much soil into the crop row, so you can get very close. On this other farm, their basket weeder was set up for greens production, and you can see they've got some nice sandy soils on Long Island and good for cultivating. And you can see how they're hugging one side of the row here. Well, they're going to come back and hug that other side. So they'll do 2 passes per bed, but they'll really get close to the crop row. So there's there's that little strip that was undisturbed, but not for long because they're coming the other way. One of the drawbacks of the basket weeders is that they're set on a bar that runs straight across the bed. So if there's any unevenness in the bed, like there was a low spot right there where some of these implements weren't even touching the ground because they were being lifted upwards on the outer side of the bed. So very flat level seed beds are important for this tool. And here we have some torsion weeders operating in carrots. And some chard. Unfortunately, as you get towards the end of the season and these mature crops, if there's any escaped weeds from earlier cultivation efforts, those are going to be too large to control with these in-row tools at this stage. Then even though this crop is 2 rows per bed, that center, they still have that center set of torsion weeders there, which is doing a little bit of weeding, so it doesn't do much harm having it there. And unfortunately, there were a lot of sticks in this field since it was recently converted from forest. And you can see that the stick is really doing a number on these young brassicas. And this is some older footage from when I was at the University of Maine working with Eric Gallant. Take a look at the torsion weeders on the right. They're adjusted pretty much optimally in this corn and operating very close to the crop row, but really flowing nicely through the soil and dislodging and uprooting a lot of weeds. And here's a springtime harrow whizzing by at probably 7 to 10 miles per hour, compared to our typical in-row or between-row cultivation tools that are more like 3 or 4 miles per hour. And these springtime harrows, people think about them as uprooting, and and they do uproot some weeds, especially some small broadleaf weeds. But to me, I think their more potent mode of action in controlling weeds is the burial. This is a farm back in Maine that uses a springtime harrow on the back of the tractor, and they have this set of sweeps and finger weeders on the front. And they say the combination of those two, kind of a stacked setup, really improves the efficacy. In that, if if there's any remaining weeds that are still surviving from the finger weeders, but have been disturbed to some extent, that the springtime harrow coming through at the end is just enough to, clean off the soil from that's clinging to any weed roots, or if they're slightly dislodged, maybe pull them out of the ground a little bit more. So it's just a nice way to finish the sequence if you're stacking together a few different tools. Just a note on soil conditions, which are really key. This is a day after a light rain early in the season, relatively soon after tillage, very loose soil conditions, which I find is best for cultivation. Compare that to these later season cultivations on some ground that wasn't nearly as nice, low organic matter, more higher clay content, very hard soil. These sweeps are really struggling to dig in, and other tools, I think you could forget about them penetrating the soil. I just wanted to highlight the cloddiness of the soil that isn't really helping the situation, and is really getting hilled in too much on this young corn crop here. And in this short clip, I just wanted to show that the fingers you can see it getting hung up on some residue here, but it sheds that residue out the back pretty effectively. And then this is the same cultivator I'm using here in winter squash, and there was a nice cereal rye cover crop here, so there's a lot of rye residue still left over, and it's shedding that residue nicely. And this is just about as early as as you can cultivate winter squash here, and I think we wanted to get early. The earlier you can, the less of a start you'll give those weeds, and I think we might have had some rain coming as well, so we had other reasons to get in there early. But I have the finger weeders adjusted here as wide as they will go. I think they're 4 or 5 inches apart at the tips, and you can see that even though they're far apart, they're still disturbing that inrow zone and throwing some soil, enough to dislodge, um, uproot, or bury some of those small cotyledon stage weeds that might just be emerging at this time. And it's important to note that finger weeders really work best when they're following something that loosens the soil right in front of them, like these sweeps here, so that the fingers can really penetrate into the soil and have some loose soil that they can throw into that crop row. Whereas when you get to the end of the season and the soil is more compact, you might have a little bit of crust. The fingers don't work nearly as well as in my opinion. On this topic of how early can you cultivate, it really depends on the crop, the stature of the crop, and where the growing point of the crop is. With this squash here, it has this first true leaf and these cotyledon leaves that are kind of sticking up, so I can throw a little bit of soil and still have them be poking up above that layer. Whereas in beets, I had some trials where we cultivated in 2-leaf stage beets and 4-leaf stage beets, and the 4-leaf stage was just about as early as you could get in there to cultivate. The 2-leaf stage were just destroyed by that in-row cultivation. Okay, and this is the same crop of winter squash, and I think I missed one cultivation that I wasn't able to film. So I think this is the third cultivation, and you can see the crop is pretty well established. but I didn't put the fingers any closer together because the crop has expanded now, and if the fingers were in there any closer, they'd be piercing through some more of those leaves and getting hung up on the branches and probably doing too much crop damage. So, but once again, here they're still disturbing most of that in-row zone either by undercutting or throwing soil. It's a little bit hard to tell from this view, but there are a lot of small cotyledon stage weeds at this point, and so it was important that we get in there to cultivate. And yeah, there's some larger weeds that escaped earlier cultivations that the fingers aren't really going to have any effect on. But we came in later in the season with a single hand weeding to control those in this organic squash experiment, which there's actually a whole website about that I'll link to in the video description. Okay, and then we have our fourth and final cultivation in the winter squash, and I had to take the finger weeders off because the squash had just expanded too much. It was a bush delicata variety, but even though it was bush, I'm still running over some of those outer leaves with the gauge wheels, and it's barely getting through, and some of those upper leaves are getting hit by the toolbar itself. So that was definitely about as late as we could cultivate. This is the same tool setup that was used in the winter squash, but now we're in the establishment year of planting of coniferous trees. Actually, and in this particular setup, something that I just wanted to try was using a narrow, I think a 3 or 4 inch wide sweep up front, followed by a wider sweep. I wanted to loosen up the soil before the wider sweep that I think was maybe 10 inches wide would go through, so that that wider sweep could as easily as possible slice through the soil and really focus on and be effective closer to the crop row. And so this wide sweep was used to get in under any branches and give the trees a wide berth from the vertical shanks that are attached to the sweep. This is the first cultivation in these trees a couple weeks after transplanting. And overall, the cultivation worked pretty well. This is another systems comparison, and looking at comparing different weed management methods. And cultivation is kind of a new thing for conifers, but overall it worked pretty well. We cultivated I think 3 times over the course of the season, just in this 3-foot band around the trees. The one exception was towards the end of the year. There were a few patches where there was some wild buckwheat, which is a weed very similar to bindweed. And I have never seen finger weeders or any cultivator get clogged up so bad as going through all this wild buckwheat. And it eventually clogs to the extent that it actually kind of clotheslines the trees going by, so we had to stop and clear things out by hand. So if you're going to be cultivating, you have to do it frequent enough that you don't allow the establishment of these bindweeds or other weeds that could potentially clog up the whole system. So I mentioned stacking a few times, and this is a term that Eric Gallant and I coined, referring to the use of several different types of tools in the same pass. And this first video was one of the first attempts where we were trying it, and we actually found a synergistic improvement in effectiveness, and that the tools worked really well together, especially if they undercut, uproot, and then buried the weeds. But we did have significant crop damage. And so in subsequent trials, we traded in the torsion weeders for sweeps. We moved the finger weeders farther away from the crop, and we removed some of the inner tines on the row harrow, and still got this great efficacy, controlling over 90% of these in-row weeds, but with less crop damage. And actually, we found that ending the sequence with some small discs worked even better than the row harrow, because the discs were able to throw just the right amount of soil while not really touching the crop. Some of the keys from today that I want to summarize are cultivating as close to your crop as possible without damaging it is kind of a fine line, as well as cultivating as shallowly as possible without skipping over any ground. We also saw that cultivating in loose conditions is best, so improving soil organic matter can help with that. Adding drainage if you can, and having very small weeds relative to the size of the crop is important as well. So giving your crop a head start by reducing the weed seed bank ahead of time, perhaps with a stale seed bed period. So thanks for watching, and for more weed management resources, check out the link that I've posted in the description below.